Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special. I'm Chris Bishop and we're here joining us, the head of the African Development Bank, Mr. Akinwumi Adesina. We're going to talk about a lot of things today. Talk about energy, we're going to talk about agriculture, we're going to talk about employment, and we're going to talk about renewable energy. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. Great pleasure any day.
And to start off with, there's $25 billion that the African Development Bank is putting up for renewable energy. How is that going to work?
Well, first and foremost, I must say that it was a great pleasure to be there in Nairobi with President Macron and President Kenyatta, and for what they're doing in terms of leadership for our world with regard to climate change. As you know, Africa accounts for no more than 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, but we suffer disproportionately for the biggest impacts of it. From floods to droughts, all over you have a lot of vulnerabilities that we actually go through because of this question. But the fact of the matter is that to solve this problem in terms of mitigation and adaptation, you need money. Now, it's going to take $3 trillion for Africa to be able to meet its obligations to deal with all of these problems from the Paris climate change meeting, summit. But question is, we've got to find the money. But Chris, the interesting thing is to look at what is happening in terms of the money flows. Globally, since 2018, you have $6 trillion that have been disinvested from fossil fuels completely. From 2015 till 2018, the 17 largest insurance companies, from Allianz to Swiss Re to Zurich, they disinvested $30 billion from coal-fired power plants. So that tells me that, the issue of fossil fuel on coal, it's the past. That's not where the future is. A lot of these things are going to eventually be stranded assets. But when it comes to Africa, we have massive amount of potential. Renewable energy alone, if you take a look at sunshine, everywhere you go, you can literally just take your cable, connect it to the sun, it'll be fine. We have 11 terawatts, Chris. 11 terawatts of potential for solar. And so the amount of potential is limitless. But the question is, how are we going to attract the financing to do this? And so I believe that first and foremost, we have to lead by example. So the African Development Bank is Africa's premier finance institution. We lead by example. And that's why we have committed $25 billion to support climate finance between 2020 and 2025. And we also look at the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds. You look at all of this. It's about $1.2 trillion that we have today. So if we can tilt that towards more climate resilient investments, then we are going to be able to help Africa to do that. So it's a big thing for us, which means actually a doubling of our commitment in terms of climate finance.
So just try and break it down for us a little bit more. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. Yeah. I'm in Africa. I've got an idea for a wind farm. I've got an idea for a solar plant. How is your initiative going to help me?
Well, in various ways. First and foremost is that these $25 billion is going to allow us to work in different areas. First, climate resilient agriculture. So financing people that are going to be able to have agriculture, more resilient agricultural practices. Secondly, is to be able to do things like drip irrigation, which is very, very important in water management and dealing with climate change. When it comes to energy, relying a lot more on solar, on wind, on geothermal. We're going to do a lot of investments in those areas. We're doing that already. If you take, for example, in Kenya, we had the Lake Turkana project, 310 megawatts of project, a power project, which is all the largest wind power plant in sub-Saharan in Africa, actually. We invested in the new Uzazate project, which is in Morocco, the largest one concentrated solar power plant in the world. But if you're a small guy, you're asking, okay, these are big guys. How am I going to get access to that? Well, we just set up a fund as part of that, which is called Facility for Energy Inclusion. It's a $400 million facility to support companies that are producing energy right about lower than 25 megawatts of power. And it's very difficult for them to get access to financing. So a $400 million facility that we've set up, it will do for both grid and off-grid solutions. So that provides capital, cheaper capital for energy entrepreneurs to be able to tap into this. One other way in which this is also going to work is if you take countries, coastal countries, that are buffeted constantly because of negative impact of climate change, they need to be able to insure themselves against these adverse effects. So the African Development Bank, as part of our financing, we are actually paying insurance premiums actually for countries to insure themselves against these catastrophic risk events. We've done that for Niger, we've done that for Gambia, we've done that for Madagascar, and we are going to continue to scale that up, because at the end of the day, if you have floods, flash floods, you have to repair infrastructure and all of these things, but you need money to do that. And so for us, this is an indication of our commitment to the future. Now, I'll tell you one thing, Chris. You know, when I was elected president of the African Development Bank, just, in 2015, between 2013 and 2015, I launched the New Deal on Energy in 2015 for the African Development Bank. The share of our investment that was going to renewable energy between 2013 and 2015 was 59%. Since we launched that in 2015, the share of our investment in energy generation that is actually going to renewable energy moved from 59% to 95%. And 2017, we reached 100% of all our investments in energy generation being in renewable energy, because I do believe that that's actually the future. And so as a president of the African Development Bank, I want to be investing where the future is. I don't want to be investing in the past.
Well, speaking of the past, you're in a country at the moment where 80% of our power here is created by coal-fired power stations, as you know. And a cautionary tale is that this country has tried, South Africa has tried to promote green energy, but it seems to have stuttered. It seems to, the government was shilly-shallying over the signing of contracts and what have you. And a lot of people I know in the renewable energy are a bit disheartened now. And a lot of their people have left to go to other countries to do it. I mean, where do you think this fits in with what you're trying to do?
Well, first and foremost is that, everybody has a past, and everybody tries to correct their past for where the future is going. Every single country in the world had energy stock, right, on their pathway, and all of them, all the advanced countries were all dependent on coal. So it's not unique to South Africa, But what is very important is what countries are doing in making the energy transition, and to be much more responsible in how we, generate energy and manage emissions in the world of climate change. We have only one world. We don't have another world. We've got to all contribute to make sure that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I must highly commend the government of South Africa, actually, because South Africa today has the most innovative and creative approach for independent power, producers that are actually doing renewable energy. We as a bank, we invest in here a lot in Eskom to support Eskom, because you've got to have energy. But we are also supporting the renewable energy. The Sere wind farm, for example, it's 100 megawatts, which we are supporting. There are other Zea solar projects that we are supporting, again, 100 megawatts that are here. So I really think the independent power producers for South Africa for renewable energy is actually a good thing. The feed-in tariffs are quite low. What we need to actually do is to make sure that we continue to support the regulatory environment to allow the independent power producers to be able to work well in terms of the feed-in tariffs that are actually quite competitive for them to be able to operate, and to give them the financing that they need to be able to do that. And plus, over time, I think South Africa wants to reduce, obviously, its energy stock in terms of generation from coal to using more renewable energy. And not just South Africa, Chris, I'll tell you, for us, I firmly believe that Africa can generate a lot of its base load power, because you need base load power to run industries from renewable energy. The problem, as you know, has always been, whether it's wind, whether it's solar, well, is instability of the supply. How do you store the energy? But technologies, they're moving very, very fast. The battery storage technologies are moving very, very, very fast. And from the African Development Bank, we supported the concentrated solar power project in Morocco. It is grid-based. Base load power, 500 megawatts. The one we did for the Lake Turkana project, which is the wind one in Kenya, it's also base load power. You go to a small country like Cape Verde, we have a Cabo Lika project, 25 megawatts. It's all wind. It's again base load. So that's why I announced in Nairobi during the One Planet Summit that the African Development Bank is launching what we call Africa Green Base Load Facility, that will allow African countries to make the transition from relying on coal towards green base load power, because you can actually now do green base load, grid-based power to be able to run industries. And I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, well, one of the problems here was, despite the wisdom of the independent power producers, as you said, it's not a practical issue. Unfortunately, it became a political issue here. People said the electricity was too expensive, it was a waste of taxpayers' money, and also that some of the money was flowing out of the country to foreign investors. How can you keep politics out of your particular initiative, you think?
Well, you know, I mean, the fact of the matter is that transparency, accountability, right due diligence are all very important in all investments that you make. But I think that one also has to realize that when new technologies and new innovations are coming up, you always have resistance. I remember growing up, my father had a telephone. It's one of those rotary telephones you dial this way, and they don't want you to use it. They put a padlock on it and you can't turn it. That was the telephone during those days. Take a look at it today. You and I, all of our lives are all on mobile phones. Innovations are pushing the edge of what you need to do. And so we just have to make sure that the policy, the legal, the regulatory environment supports innovation. And you also support competition because you have to also drive prices down. And the thing is that always in the early phase of innovation, the prices tends to be high. But over time, as you have greater competition, you can really significantly reduce that price. And that's what's going to happen for energy.
Okay. Next 5 years then, how are we in business here in Africa going to notice the fruits of what you're talking about?
Well, in the next 5 years, you will, because first and foremost, we are rapidly scaling up our investment in the energy sector, as you know, both in terms of generation, in terms of transmission, and also in terms of distribution. Let me just mention some key ones that you are going to see us investing massively. We are embarking on what I call the Desert to Power initiative, which is all about providing universal access to electricity all across the Sahelian region of Africa. So if you look at the Sahel has the highest in terms of sunlight irradiance in the world, and 7 kilowatts per hour per meter squared. It's one of the largest in the world. But why is it Niger, Chad, Mali, they don't have access to much electricity? Yes, the sun is there, and the sun can burn your skin off. That's how fast it's at, that's how hot it is. So we've decided to launch this thing called the Desert to Power initiative. It is to help to build, with our partners, of course, 10,000 megawatts of solar. That will be the largest solar power zone in the world. That will allow us, with our plan is to be able to get to this by 2025, that will build for us access to power for 250 million people. That will provide roughly about 90 million people access to electricity via off-grid, because off-grid systems are becoming very, very important. And that's going to change the face of the Sahel. And I was speaking, to the presidents there. I was discussing also with President Macron of France about this. That what it will do for the Sahel is as follows. First and foremost, you can do drip irrigation in the Sahel from solar-powered pumps. Second, that would change agriculture, which is the main livelihood there. Second is security. Terrorists, they like dark places. If there's no electricity, terrorists have a field day. And so that will help with insecurity problem. And third, it will help with the migration crisis. Look, Chris, you and I, when we were kids growing up, what do you see? You see insects, right? Where it's dark, the insect move away to where there's light. Like we always had to do that. It's the same. And so if you're trying to deal with migration in Europe, just support Africa to be able to light up and power itself. And so this is the biggest thing you're going to see us do. The other project, which is going to be quite interesting, especially for you here in South Africa, is the INGA project. The INGA
in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo. That potential is 40,000 megawatts. And I had a great discussion with President Tshisekedi also in Nairobi just 2 days ago about that project. Obviously, the one we are investing right now is called the INGA 3 project, which is originally 4,800 megawatts, but they've moved it to 11,000 megawatts. And that we are going to conclude because they have they have now the companies that are actually going to do it, the Tragorge of China and a Spanish company, that will provide 11,000 megawatts. It's just give you some examples of some of the things that you are going to see. But I don't want to give an impression that it's all about just power generation. It's about also how you connect the poor to electricity. And we have a lot of programs which we call last mile connectivity project that will connect millions of people, poor people, to electricity. It's not just about power, it's about access.
Well, we're going to talk a lot more about such issues in the second half. We're going to a break now. Do stay tuned to this CNBC Africa special. Well, welcome back to the CNBC Africa special. I'm Chris Bishop and I'm talking to Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank. We've been talking about renewable energy, and this half of the program we want to talk about investment, money, and how to put this continent to work. So just to start off with, Mr. President, is the African Investment Forum in this very town. Just a few months ago, you got pledges of more than $30 billion. I want to know how much of that money has come.
Oh, well, you know, first, we were delighted to be here. It was a phenomenal forum. Actually, we got investment commitments of $38.7 billion during that particular meeting. And since that meeting, a lot of work has been going on in terms of the concretization of all the investments, promises that were actually made at that forum. You know, as you know, there was a big announcement that was made on railways during the meeting by a company called Tello with Deutsche Bahn, which is the German company, to mobilize financing for closing a gap of $62 billion on railways. I was talking to the CEO recently, and he was excited of how far they have gone in closing many of these deals. Quite a lot of these things are being closed very fast, and I expect that by the time that we reconvene in November, that you will see tremendous amount of investments that have actually happened.
I mean, what would be your target for then to actual delivered investments by the time we come back to the ARF again in November?
Well, you know, first and foremost, you know, we have to constantly raise that level of ambition because the infrastructure gap is quite massive. So we need to actually continue to ask for a lot more investments. So I'll expect a lot more investments, but I certainly expect that most of it will have been closed by then.
And next year's target, what are you setting yourself?
It's actually this year. I don't want to give you a figure, but I think that you know, my own approach to things is that you start things, you close them well, and then you move to a higher level. I expect that we'll be able to do a lot more.
So just give us an idea of some of the projects that we can actually see there in bricks and mortar across this continent that will be the children of these investment pledges.
Well, you know, first and foremost, like if you look at Nigeria, one of the big projects that was on brass fertilizer, they got about almost 2.6 or almost $3 billion of investment commitments from us and several others, which is going very well. It's a very large fertilizer manufacturing plant that's there. There's a big petrochemical company in Egypt that also got probably the largest investment from the African Investment Forum. That's going very well as well. As you know, there was a deal that was also done by South African investors with Ghana on the Accra Sky Train. That one's also going very well. We're seeing quite a lot of traction that is happening on that. And so there's so many like that. Of course, we signed the Memorandum of Understanding to make investment in the new Congo Bridge that will link the two Congos, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Congo-Brazzaville. And that is $800 million between the Africa 50, ourselves and other partners, and that's also going quite well. So I am quite positive about, you know, the direction that things are going. And what I say to myself is this: what does this really mean for Africa? You know, Chris, when we put this Africa Investment Forum together, and we got $38.7 billion of investment commitments in less than 72 hours, what does that really mean? You take the entire multilateral development banks globally, right? In 2018, the total amount that the multilateral development banks mobilized in terms of direct capital was $49.9 billion globally. And at the African Investment Forum, collectively with all the other DFIs, development finance institutions, I'm very, very proud of all of them, all of our partners, we did $38.7 billion. That's almost like 78% of what all the multilateral development banks did globally. And so we are committed to that. And I think the multilateral development banks globally, we recognize that there's a big gap in terms of infrastructure finance. It's $1 trillion. But I'm not scared of those monies, because there's so much money out there looking for great projects. I chair the Africa 50, which is right now $870 million private equity fund for infrastructure that we set up. And they are doing some phenomenal thing on infrastructure. But when you take a look at it, Chris, pension funds globally, sovereign funds globally, and mutual funds in terms of insurance pool of funds, it's $130 trillion. So when we say we want to move from billions to trillions, you don't go to where the billions are. You go to where the trillions are and try to get it to where you really want it to be. And that's I took over this year, January, at the World Economic Forum in Davos as the chair of the Multilateral Development Bank presidents globally. And one thing that we committed ourselves to is to really do this by the following ways: leveraging global pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and other institutional investors, getting the right projects, preparing the right project. Secondly, having facilities that allows us to de-risk those investments by those pension funds globally, and then to involve in regulatory changes, reforms that will allow many of these funds to have infrastructure as an asset class that they can actually invest in. So apart from the African Investment Forum, ourselves, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and all other international multilateral development banks, we are engaged on a big effort to leverage more funds from the global pension funds into infrastructure more globally and a lot more into Africa.
What's the feeling you're getting from investors in the United States? There's still this tremendous feeling in Africa that since the end of the Obama years and the Trump administration, that Africa's fallen off the United States radar when it comes to such things. What's the feeling you're getting?
Well, let me say that for Africa, Africa can never fall off the radar screen of anybody, except the investors are not looking closely at where the trends are going. You look at Africa today, you have the youngest population in the world, fast growing population in terms of urban population, middle class growing very rapidly. You have business to business investment expenditures by 2030 is going to be roughly $3.5 trillion. Household expenditures going to reach almost $2 trillion. And so that is the place to be, right? The rate of return on investment in Africa is very high. And so I will expect, the United States just set up a new facility to be able to do private investments around the world. And of course, we're discussing with them, they are going to look at investments in Africa. Energy, big. The U.S. government's Power Africa initiative is a very good initiative, and so we continue to work with them on that. No, I don't expect that U.S. investments in Africa will decline at all. I expect that the U.S. investment will actually increase because whether it's in the energy space, whether it's in infrastructure space, and whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in urban housing, or even financial markets, the opportunities are massive. I say when you take a look at China, and look at massive investment by China in Africa, look at what India is doing in Africa. What are they seeing? They are seeing that Africa is the place where the rate of return is highest. And we as Multilateral Development Bank, our job is to make sure that we improve the policy, the regulatory environment, the business climate, so that investments can continue to move. And it is happening. I'll give you an example. Chancellor Merkel led a phenomenal effort of G20 on what we call Compact with Africa. So ourselves as the African Development Bank, working with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and so we've been working to help countries to put their house in order, in terms of policies, investment frameworks, and all of that. Now, what happened? all the countries that are part of the compact with Africa, they saw foreign direct investment going into them increase by 46%, while other countries that are not part of that compact with Africa saw investments in foreign direct investment go down by about 32% in those countries. You and I were talking just now about the Africa Investment Forum. At the Africa Investment Forum, of the $38.7 billion that we were able to mobilize in terms of investment, you know how much went to the compact with African countries? $18.5 billion. So that tells you that policy reforms work. Business regulatory investment improvement works. And so I am very, very confident that Africa will continue to develop faster as Africa opens up the business environment. We reduce red tape, regulations, transparency, just allow a love of private capital. Because the way I look at private capital is this: if you're trying to invest in infrastructure, massive, yes, I know, but it's like you have a bigger weight on the ground. You want to pick it up, right? I can either bend and try to pick it up myself, or I can use a pulley to do it, right? And so the pulley helps me to do that. And that's what the private sector is. The private sector is not an enemy of government. The private sector is a friend of government on investment.
Well, on that inspirational and hopeful note, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this CNBC Africa special. We've been talking to Akinwumi Adesina, the head of the African Development Bank. For me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.